He does not look very happy. Welcome back to the Fruit of Grisaia. We're on Yumiko's route. The last episode. Oh, yeah. Yumiko. Yuji was pulled off the assignment, but Yumiko was like, well, I'll pay you to be my bodyguard. So, we're still Yumiko's bodyguard. Much to the chagrin of my superiors and Yumiko's father. They don't like it.
何か申し開きすることはあるかね。
私どもに後ろ暗い話など一切ございませんが。
とぼけるのもいい加減にしたまえ。あなた方に排除するよう申し付けた例の風見何がしとかいうチンピラ、相変わらず由美子の周りでうろちょろしているそうではないか。しかも私の立てた計画においてもことごとく邪魔ばかりしている。これでもなお何もしていないというなどずうずうしいにも程があるだろう。
私は正式に風見雄二に対して護衛の任を解くよう伝えました。当組織の規律及び当人の性格から命令違反は考えられません。
ではこの状況を一体どう説明するというのだ。
推測ではありますが、風見雄二が由美子さんの護衛を解く際、本人にその旨を伝達したのではないかと思われます。その上で不安に思った由美子さんから個人的なものとして風見雄二に護衛をする旨の依頼があったのではないだろうかと。
Kevin Costner.
仮にそのようなことがあったとしても断るのが当然だろう。
それは社長のおっしゃる当然です。私はその当然を先日お伺いした際に尋ねられなかったので、そのようにしなかっただけです。
そのようなお子様の論理が通るとでも思っているのか。
子供でも大人でも約束や命令は絶対だと私どもは考えます。
Look at that guy's face. He is really mad. You can tell when his eyes open that he's very emotional.
もういい。帰りたまえ。
はい、失礼します。
娘の件だが、市ヶ谷の連中が妙な動きをするようになった。
いかがいたしましょうか。
Aid. He has no name. He doesn't need one.
腕の立つ人間を揃えてくれ。
Oh.
多少荒っぽいことをしても構わん。
Uh-oh. This could be bad. Hope Yuji doesn't let his guard down fighting all those weaklings.
わかりました。妨害する者への排除について生死は問わないと捉えてよろしいでしょうか。
Potentially lethal force. I don't like the sound of that.
ああ。仮にそうなったとしても問題はない。存分にやれ。
That's not good. That's bad. Those are very bad words.
了解いたしました。少々お時間をいただくかとは思います。
急いでくれ。準備が整うまでは襲撃も一旦休止しろ。
Oh no.
はい。ではそのように。
おとなしく従っていればいいものを。読み込め。
It's been several days since I came into Sakaki's employ. Strangely enough, they've been largely peaceful. That confused encounter immediately after she hired me was the last time those people tried anything. That doesn't mean they've given up, of course. More likely they've withdrawn for the moment to prepare a more decisive move. I can afford to be a little less vigilant, but I'm careful not to let my guard down entirely. Another beautiful day. Yuji in that ridiculous pose. Come to think of it, why are you always wearing that school uniform? Well, we're on vacation, so normally you'd wear casual clothes every once in a while. I was just wondering if there was some reason you don't.
それはみだりに私服姿で辺りをうろうろするものではないわ。そういうのは素行の良くない子がすることでしょ。
And I guess everyone else in our school is a juvenile delinquent in the making, eh?
他の子たちは知らないわ。私は前の学園でそう教えられたからそうしているだけ。人にそれを押し付けるようなつもりもないわ。
Okay, fair enough. Sakaki's grown calm enough to humor me with pointless small talk of this sort, which is weird because she's usually not a talker. She seems much less tense after several days without violent interruption. Probably because there's no need for constant wariness, the movement of her pencil appears to have grown smoother as well. All of a sudden her hand stops moving. What's wrong? With a brief exhalation of breath, she glances over at me out of the corner of her eye. You notice something? What's wrong? Turning her face away at my words, Sakaki curls her body forward over her sketchbook. Aw. Oh, you're welcome. Her voice is almost small enough to be lost in the wind, but I can hear clearly enough. What was that?
あなたがこうして護衛してくれるから、安心して絵に集中することができるわ。
Sakaki?
いや、というよりも、あなたがいるから、というわけでもないのだけれど。
This is suspicious.
また何か。
Well, I mean, a thank you like this from Sakaki of all people? Don't tell me. Is that why nothing's been happening the last few days?
Huh?
Huh? I see it all fits. Sakaki's already been kidnapped, and the person sitting in front of me is an imposter. Classic trick, but you just gave yourself away. Ha! What have you done with Sakaki? If you're not planning to talk, I'm prepared to.
私はここにいるわよ。ボケるのもいい加減にしてちょうだい。
Jeez, I'm just playing along, okay? Having some fun. Sakaki, is that you after all?
今の一言で気づくとか、本当にバカにしてるのね。
What do you mean by that? I'm only considering every possible scenario so I can respond to minor abnormalities before.
もういいわよ。お仕事お疲れ様ね。
What are you so angry about? She seemed to be in an unusually good mood just a minute ago, but now she's in full sulk mode. For all the severe lectures I've received from JB and others regarding the treatment of women, seems I still have a great deal of room of improvement for when it comes to interactions with females in my own age group. Sighing ruefully, I closed my eyes for a moment. But it was a moment too long, for she was attacked. No, she wasn't attacked. Honestly, if only the sky would give me a little advance warning, I wouldn't get struck by lightning at such random moments. A pop of water against my forehead brings me back to reality. I raise my head and look up at the sky. Damn rain. The weatherman said it would be clear today. Oh, I'm going to write him a tersely worded letter. Just you wait. Seriously? At some point, it's filled up with angry gray rain clouds. I wonder what a happy gray rain cloud look like. Huh, I'll have to ask Sakaki if she can draw one for me. I noticed it was looking a little overcast, but I hadn't expected such a sudden, dramatic turn for the worse. For a moment, I considered attributing the abrupt storm to Sakaki's out-of-character remarks, disturbing the balance of the universe or something. But I have the feeling she wouldn't appreciate the gag. She's not a humorous person, that one. She'll warm up eventually.
大変、急いで帰らないと。
Sakaki immediately begins to push her art supplies back into her tote bag. Wouldn't want it to get wet. But the rain, indifferent to our concerns, rapidly intensifies.
このままだと帰る頃には濡れネズミになりそうね。
With a slightly archaic expression that reveals her for the avid reader she is, Sakaki accurately forecasts an unfortunate future. Guess there's nothing for it. Let's wait this out over there. I point at the bridge that stands comparatively nearby. It was just part of the scenery up until now, but at that moment it's our best option for shelter from the rain.
鉄橋?
Yeah, come on, I think it'd be best to run. Leading Sakaki along the river, I hurry to the bridge as the rain steadily grows stronger. She follows close behind, her bag protectively clutched to her chest. Having sprinted all out for 200 meters or so, Sakaki's completely out of breath by the time we reach our shelter. You alright? Get your breathing back to normal, then take a seat and rest for a while. We're gonna be here a while, it seems. The area under the bridge quickly falls into shadow. Even the faint light trickling through the cracks in the storm clouds can't reach us through the heavy iron above. Fortunately, since we're more or less in the country, there isn't much junk littering the area compared to what you'd find in a city. Sometimes an empty bottle or can rolls by on the river, but that's about it. Sakaki and I brush off a light layer of dirt from the bare concrete foundation of the bridge and settle ourselves down to wait out the storm. As the girl at my side tries her best to wipe the water from her hair with a handkerchief, I examine the state of affairs outside. Yep, it's still raining. Okay. The streaks of rain have only grown larger and more frequent. There's no sign of it stopping anytime soon. The sky, slightly gray and cloudy only minutes ago, is already a sea of uninterrupted black. Country town like this, they don't even light the streets properly. The area's already grown dark as if to exasperate our unease. And finally, there's that familiar roar, the sound that always seems to accompany summer downpours. Thunder can be a frightening thing. I had colleagues with experience on a mountain rescue operations who cowered nervously every time a storm rolled by. Judging from the sound, it's relatively close. Probably best not to move around too much at the moment. I guess we'll have to kill some time here, Sakaki. Let's say we swap stories. Turning to my side, I try to make eye contact. She doesn't meet my gaze. Her throat moves, I can hear a faint gulp. Come to think of it, this girl had an unexpectedly fearful side. I should probably reassure her that it can't strike us here. But just as I'm opening my mouth to speak... Oh my god, that was loud. Girl's got a set of lungs, to be sure. Oh, isn't that a beautiful scene? I say that for everything, don't I? Oh, so cliche. Sakaki Yumiko doesn't let other people touch her. And it's completely unthinkable that she touched them herself. When rain falls on her head, she brushes it off. When wind blows in her face, she forces her way stubbornly through it. That's the person I thought she was. And that's why this doesn't feel quite real to me. Especially after those strangely sweet words of thanks from before. It feels like I've stepped into some oddly realistic dream. I see. Seems you really are quite the scaredy cat, Sakaki. I understood quickly enough. It'd be easiest to pretend that was the reason. But the fact of the matter is, it's hard to blame this on her naturally fearful side. Something else seems to have taken hold of the young woman trembling in my arms. Something powerful and difficult to understand. Sakaki? It's still fairly warm out, but her clothes are wet with rain. Only natural that her body temperature would fall. I try to convince myself that's the only reason Sakaki's trembling, but it doesn't quite work. She finally speaks, wringing the words out of her throat. Her voice is frail and utterly weak in a way I never would have thought possible from the Sakaki I know. With that, the last of my strained explanations crumble. This is something new entirely. A side of her I've never seen before. Sakaki's cowering in terror. Even menaced by thugs on a daily basis, even when she couldn't completely hide her fear, she went about her business as usual. But that stubborn, prideful, resolute person seems to have melted away. Almost as if the rain had done it for me. All that's left is a frightened, trembling little girl, clinging to me like a life preserver. A diesel locomotive passes overhead with a loud, sustained roar. The water that had gathered on top of the bridge rains down to either side. The very air around us seems to shake. But Sakaki doesn't react. She lies on top of my body, completely motionless except for her trembling, and waits for the thunder to pass. That's not a problem. I can't bring myself to ask her anything. There was obviously something behind Sakaki's behavior, but it was such a strong reaction that it feels wrong to ask out of mere curiosity. The rain slaps heavily on the bridge above. The wind whistles loudly by outside, sometimes driving water into us from the side. But now that the thunder has passed, Sakaki seems to be gradually regaining her calm. Cuddling close, Sakaki stares up into my eyes. Think I'm strong? I might look strong to you, but I've really never thought of myself that way. On my own, huh? What is it? Go ahead. I told you before, didn't I? If you want to talk, I'm willing to listen. That's why I'm here. Sakaki nods, and in that small, soft tone, she begins to tell me about herself. The rain shows no sign of letting up. Her quiet voice flows past me and dissolves into the deepening darkness. The weakness of those words seemed to echo the fragility of the girl in my arms. The summer sun scorched the ground beneath our feet. In the heart of the ancient capital, we walked uphill, following the road away from the station's eastern exit. I was talking, casually, of trivial things. Looking up at the person holding my hand, I smiled. In contrast to my cheerful chattering, the woman walking at my side had a clouded expression on her face. Her profile was was beautiful but cold, almost like that of a marble statue. The same words, repeated in the same tone, as if she were playing back as a recording. Not understanding what that signified, I continued to speak. That trivial little event must have made me very happy, because I just kept on talking. Sentence flowed into sentence with barely a pause for breath in between. Matching the rhythm of my skipping steps, I pattered on faster and faster, filled with innocent excitement. First, her feet came to a stop. And without turning to look at me, her face still in profile, my mother finally answered. Her quiet voice emerged only to melt away into the squawking of the cicadas. Two pleasures, escaping in the conversation, abruptly taken from me. I hesitated uncertainly, not sure where to direct my gaze. But soon I found a clear path forward, and my hesitation gave way to a reply. It was the phrase, "I'm sorry." How many times had I spoken those words by then? Even when I'd done nothing wrong. Even when I'd done nothing at all, those words offered an exit from any uncomfortable moment. And above all else, they lightened the burden on my mother's heart. Mumbling those words had always been the best that I could do at times like those. And my mother, in turn, offered me the same soft words of apologies. In retrospect, it might very well have been her fault that I developed a habit of relying on the words, "I'm sorry." She spoke the phrase so frequently, it was probably only natural that I'd begun to imitate her.
行きましょう。
A cold profile, a rigid face, locked in position, never turning to me. Speaking a few words with nothing but a slight movement of her lips, my mother began to walk once more, her strides even smaller than usual. With a nod, I stepped forward at my mother's side, slipping halfway into the shadow cast by her parasol. As the shade swayed with her steps, the blazing sun flickered before my eyes like a movie shot on cheap film. We walked in silence through the midsummer heat, surrounded by the voices of cicadas. I squeezed my mother's hand tightly, very tightly, as if that connection was the only thing in the world I could rely on. My mother, Masako, was born in the Kawamoto family, owners of a real estate business in the ancient city of Kamakura. After graduating from university, she accepted an arranged marriage to my father, Sakaki Michiaki. She was 25 years old. The Kawamoto were small-time landowners, and their business had fallen into financial problems. When their only daughter married the young president of East Beach Railways, a company that had taken complete control of the regional railroad network, the Kawamoto family treated it as a miracle comparable to winning the lottery.
お帰りなさいませ。
ああ。
あなた、お食事は？
もう済ませた。いつものことを毎度毎度聞くんじゃない。着替えは？
はい、用意してあります。
すぐに支度する。30分後に出るから、玄関に出して小島に渡しておいてくれ。
はい。
お父さん。
My father was a complete workaholic with more than one house to return to. He only came to see us once a week, and never stayed longer than an hour. At that point, I hadn't so much as held a conversation with him. All I could remember were brief moments of eye contact in the hallway when we passed each other by. I can still remember the way he looked at me. There was no emotion in his gaze, not even contempt. Almost as if he didn't realize something was there. His eyes were frighteningly empty. My room in that house was pointlessly large. Spacious as it was, it hadn't been made for a child to live in. The bed and closet were both adult-sized. For the most part, it looked like nothing more than just another guest room. A child's desk, a haphazardly purchased assortment of stuffed animals and toys, they were the only objects that suggested otherwise. And they felt deeply out of place.
どんな挨拶をしたらお父さん返事してくれるのかな？
I stood in front of my mirror, practicing many different facial expressions, earnestly thinking over a problem with no solution.
どんな顔をしたらお父さんは帰ってきてくれるのかな？
Alone in a room far too large for me, I thought about the stone-faced father I barely knew. How could I catch his attention? How could I make him realize I was even there?
おはようございます。おはようございます。おはようございます。違うのかな？どうなのかな？おはようございます。おはようございます。おはようございます。
Within that state and conservative railroad family, a daughter bore a little weight. My mother's marriage had seemed a blessing for the Kawamoto family, but when she gave birth to me, it quickly became an uncomfortable topic. Her job had been to give birth to an heir, to inherit the East Beach Empire. Instead, she had produced a daughter, at best a potential tool for political marriage. No one was to blame for that, but it was still a deep disappointment to those around her. My father had treated his new wife very kindly at first, but after I came into the world and he learned that my mother was too physically frail to endure many pregnancies, he became noticeably brusque and distant. That transformation must have hurt my mother deeply. After it began, she grew gradually weaker in body and spirit until finally she could no longer manage to take care of father's personal needs. My mother returned to her parents when I was 6 years old. She had endured as best she could, desperate not to leave a bad impression on my father's family, but my mother was fundamentally a sheltered and fragile woman. Putting aside her physical condition, her mind had been worn down to the point where she could simply no longer cope. And so, one hot midsummer day, she gathered our luggage, took my hand, and left the Sakaki house.
ただいま戻りました。
ああ、おかえり。
おかえりなさい。
It wasn't a joyous homecoming for anyone involved. After an exchange of indescribably uncomfortable greetings, they began an equally awkward conversation.
美佐子、体の具合は？
大丈夫です。何もありません。それならしっかり治して道明さんのためにも早く戻ってあげないとね。はい。
It was obvious at a glance that my mother couldn't possibly go back anytime soon. Still, my pragmatic grandparents wanted their daughter back with the Sakaki family before the wound of separation grew too deep. My mother may have wanted to return herself, even knowing that she was no longer capable of enduring that life. There was a slight edge of frustration in her voice as she vaguely affirmed my grandparents' words.
お母さん。
They left me out of the conversation so completely that I began to feel invisible. In the end, I couldn't help but call out. When I spoke, my mother's hand twitched around mine, as if only just realizing that she'd been pulling me along at her side. As if she'd been trying to forget an unpleasant reality by averting her eyes from it.
由美子、おじいちゃんとおばあちゃんにご挨拶なさい。
Still not looking in my direction, my mother muttered those words quietly.
おじいちゃん、おばあちゃん、こんにちは。
I tried out the greeting I had practiced for Dad on my grandparents.
ああ、こんにちは。
こんにちは。
And their responses were stiff and awkward. They didn't so much as smile at me. It had already been decided that my mother would be hospitalized. Originally, the doctors had recommended admitting her to a psychiatric ward, but her return home under the cloud of a separation would no doubt become the subject of gossip in the area. Who knew what people would say about a mental illness on top of it all? Instead, Mom returned home under the superficial cover of poor health and entered a general hospital. My grandparents had been busy enough with their struggling business, now they had new burdens on their hands, and they made no attempt to hide their exhaustion. The complaining began on the very first day.
かわいそうに。生まれたのが女の子じゃなかったら、美佐子もこんな。
おい、やめないか。
だって、あなただっておっしゃってたじゃありませんか。せっかくの機会だったのに、台無しになってしまったって。
それはそうだが。
だから女の子だって分かった時に、お医者様に強く言ってでもやり直しをすればよかったのですよ。
美佐子の体が持たないことはお前も分かっていたじゃないか。
でも。
During the years I spent living with my mother's family, my grandparents never showed me anything like affection. In retrospect, I was an unwanted burden, a symbol of failure. I suppose they hardly had any reason to welcome me, but even so, it was a form of cruelty.
美佐子も入院するし、由美子を学校に通わせないといけないし、どうしたらいいんだか。
榊の家からは生活費も出ているのだから、それでいいじゃないか。
よくありませんわよ。会社の方が当座の資金にも苦しい状況なのに、あなたどうしてそんなにのんきなことを言っていられるんですか？
おい、そんな言い方はないだろう。
The two of them seemed to quarrel virtually every minute of every day, right until I left the house. They were considerate enough not to behave this way around my mother, but their unwanted grandchild was a different story. Raw emotions flew back and forth as if I wasn't even there.
お犬さん、可愛かったな。
When I was inside the house, I couldn't help hearing unpleasant conversations. It was a small mercy that we had one of the spacious gardens so typical in country towns. I'd always slip out there when I saw my grandparents talking with serious expressions on their faces. I passed the time scratching on the ground with tree branches. Those scribbles in the dirt became an escape. A portal to a vague, faraway world.
いつお家に帰るのかな?
Recalling what I'd seen through the window that day, I moved the point of my tree branch through the soil. Recalling my few happy memories, I drew them out one by one, over and over, hoping to make them even slightly more vivid in my mind. My drawing improved quickly in pursuit of a clear and unmistakable exit from reality. I carefully combed my shoulder-length hair and tied it back with a rubber band. I hadn't particularly been trying to grow it out, but once I understood that haircuts cost money, it simply allowed things to take their own course. Not to imply that my grandparents were keeping me in rags, they were far too vain for that. I always had the minimum necessary to look respectable. But ever since I'd grown old enough to understand my position, it was difficult to muster the slightest interest in fashion. I opted for plain dark clothes. The more inconspicuous, the better. My hair fell straight to the shoulder in the simplest possible style. As a child, I wanted nothing more than to be noticed, but at some point, I'd begun to seek refuge in my own anonymity. It seemed safer to be ignored.
行ってきます.
Pausing under the weathered eaves, I offered a farewell to no one in particular, and walked off alone. I had grown tall. I was wearing a middle school uniform now. Nobody had commented on that fact. Ever since arriving at that place, I had been alone. Oh, there are always people in the house, but I was alone.
Yumiko 嬢ちゃん、今日のお弁当ですよ。
ありがとう、トシエさん。
As I left the house, I found Toshi-san waiting outside. Toshi-san was an old woman who had looked after my grandparents' family for many years as their housekeeper. Even when the business fell in hard times and could no longer afford the expenses, she stayed in the house next door, taking care of us without any compensation. I wasn't her employer, but she always called me Miss in a kindly tone of voice. She was the only person in my life who showed me real affection.
制服、なんだか恥ずかしいな。
何を言いますか。嬢ちゃん、よう似合ってますよ。
ありがとう。そんなこと言ってくれるの、トシエさんだけよ。
嬢ちゃん。
それじゃあ、行ってきます。
I didn't talk with anyone at my middle school, or rather, I couldn't. It was an insular place where relationships had long since been firmly established, often mirroring the connections between parents. Someone abruptly wedged in from the outside had very little hope of fitting in. Much less for a quiet girl who had moved out to the country under circumstances like mine. None of the other children were friendly to me. I knew they talked about me behind my back. But after the years I'd spent alone with my grandparents, I suppose I'd grown used to such casual disdain. My student life didn't feel particularly painful, it was merely empty. I filled the vast stretches of empty time by drawing pictures. It was a habit I'd picked up as a means of escaping into fantasy, but as I came to accept reality, the images changed gradually into simple landscapes. Not to say that I was viewing things more positively now. I'd simply grown numb. The contents of my drawings mattered less to me than the time I could kill moving pencil over paper. I no longer looked for meaning in the art itself. My grandfather had a pile of empty sketchbooks, abandoned from the days when he had time to pursue his hobbies. I made a rare request and took them as my own. Day in and day out, I filled their pages with dull landscapes. With mechanical movements, I drew hollow images of a hollow world. When school ended, I would make my way over to the hospital where my mother was staying. The hospital was further from my grandparents' house than my middle school, and to reach it I had to walk a good 2 kilometers, first descending a slope and then climbing back up. I didn't have a bicycle, and asking for bus fare would have been unpleasant, so I always traveled that road on foot, Of course, it wasn't pleasant, but I'd developed an obstinate streak in my own right. That hike had become a part of my daily routine.
あら、榊さん。
A familiar nurse called out to me as I walked down a familiar hallway.
こんにちは。
今日はお母さん、朝から具合もいいみたいよ。ご飯もちゃんと食べてるし。
そうですか。
こうやって榊さんが毎日お見舞いに来てくれるからね。きっと。
そんなことは。
Equivocating with a weak smile, I nodded to the nurse and walked away. My mother's condition was always seesawing from improvement to setback. And it wasn't the sort of disease that could be cured with some wonder drug, and in Mother's case, the doctors didn't entirely understand the cause of her illness, or even the reason she wasn't healing. There was no clear path to a complete recovery. By that point, I understood that my existence had a great deal to do with her sickness. My visits couldn't possibly have been helping her. It was probably just the opposite. I walked rapidly toward room 301 in the A ward. There was a part of me that thought those visits were pointless, but without them I would have lost the only thing I had left, my origins. Even as I isolated myself behind an inconspicuous appearance, in that one place I desperately sought some kind of connection.
お母さん。
My mother had been given a private room. The hospital's administrator was an old acquaintance of my grandfather, so it had been arranged at a considerable discount, or so our gossipy neighbors believed. It was a pure white room, largely empty except for the plain medical bed standing by the window. My mother passed her days lying there. There was no medical reason she couldn't go out, but she never tried.
あ、由美子。今日も来てくれたのね。
My mother greeted me with the most convincing smile she could force onto her face. But that face didn't turn toward me.
今日は具合がいいって、さっき看護師さんが。
Setting up a folding chair at her bedside, I began to speak. Her physician had asked me to fill the visits with conversation. Even the silliest little things will do. Just keep talking to her, please.
ご飯もちゃんと食べられて、よかったね。
But I filled every moment with silly chat for a different reason entirely.
そう。
それでね。
The conversation was almost entirely one-sided. My mother's responses were mostly monosyllabic. It was difficult to tell if she was even listening. Even so, I continued to chatter away.
今日もいい天気だね。
Eventually, I ran out of things to talk about, and changed the topic to the weather out of desperation, but by then, even the monosyllabic responses had trickled to a halt. Time flowed by in silence. 1 minute of silence. 3, 5. Finally, my mother slowly opened her mouth to speak. Even before the words came, my body twitched in alarm.
ごめんね。本当に。お母さん、こんなんで。
そんなこと。
When my mother spoke to me, it was always to deliver an apology. That was why I babbled away so persistently. I didn't want to give her the chance to speak.
今日はもう帰るね。
そう。
Folding the chair with a few practiced movements, I leaned it against the small shelf on the wall.
それじゃあ、また明日。
I came to this place in search of connection, and every day I went home with nothing but disappointment. To be honest, those visits were painful for me. Sometimes I thought about how much nicer it would be to just stop coming entirely. But without my faint connection to my mother, I would be adrift in a sea of nothingness. I had no choice but to hold stubbornly to that single lifeline. I wasn't under any illusions that my conversations with Mom were doing her any good. In fact, her physicians had begun to indirectly allude otherwise. Something along the lines of, "You don't have to come every single day, dear." But I was afraid. What if my mother did recover? If I abandoned her now, she might not take me with her when she returned to her old home. I didn't have many pleasant memories of that place, but at least there was something. At least there I was something other than an object of scorn. At least there I had something like an identity. and I couldn't return unless my mother took me with her. I hated myself for those selfish thoughts, but I didn't stop visiting. Pushing everything that had brought us there out of my mind, I clung stubbornly to the childish hope of a happy ending waiting around the next corner. The first year of my middle school life flowed by aimlessly. The only thing I had gained in that time was a bit of textbook knowledge, and apart from that, I hadn't learned a thing. I'm fairly sure my grades were good. I didn't want to give anyone the chance to criticize me on that front. Becoming a difficult child would be too risky. My place in the world was tenuous enough as it was. Thinking back on it now, I might have been just happier running away, but having spent my entire life shut up inside a box, the idea of trying to escape didn't even occur to me. Just as 1 year ago I said goodbye to no one in particular and left the house alone. Nothing had changed. The scenery was still the same. My life was the same. Everything in that country town was static.
奥様と旦那様を恨まないでやってくださいな。
That morning when Toshi-san handed me my lunchbox, I found myself grumbling a few rare complaints about my situation. The targets were mainly my grandparents. We'd been living together for many years now, and still they only spoke to me when it was absolutely necessary. Every moment I spent in the house made me feel as if I was slowly suffocating.
だけど、おじいちゃんもおばあちゃんも、まるで私がいないかのような態度を取るんだもの。
貧すれば心も鈍する。今は由美子嬢ちゃんに構って差し上げられる余裕がないんですよ。
そうなのかしら。
由美子嬢ちゃんはこんなにいい子なんですから、いつかきっとちゃんと見てくださいますよ。
我慢だなんて、としえさんにはいつもお世話になりっぱなしで。
嬢ちゃん。
Nothing about our household had changed in years. As always, our lifestyle was dependent on Toshi-san's quiet assistance. She took care of us all without a single complaint. But I hadn't seen my grandparents show her gratitude for everything she did. Not even once. Toshi-san's son, who lived with his wife in the neighborhood, clearly wanted to pry his mother away from her unrewarded servitude to the Kawamoto family. I'd overheard them having a heated fight on the topic. Our life was the same as it always had been, but beneath the surface it was slowly coming apart at the seams.
としえさん、もう来てくれなくなるのかな。
One day I was making my way along a sloping road I had once walked with my mother, bombarded by the cries of cicadas. The area around my grandparents' home was a district with strict regulations of the height and variety of buildings, so the scenery hadn't changed much in the years since my mother entered the hospital. It was picturesque in a way that seemed to appeal to rich people. Many city dwellers had their second houses nearby, but I could never come to enjoy the scenery. It left me cold. The things that mattered to me changed for the worse. But the things I hated, the things that left me cold, never seemed to go away. Driven by frustrating, indistinct feelings of powerlessness, I began to walk faster. But with a flinch of surprise, my legs suddenly came to a halt.
やあ、おはよう由美子ちゃん。学校に行くところ？歩きながらでいいからさ、ちょっとおじさんの話に付き合ってもらえないかな。
After that moment of hesitation, my legs began to move once more, faster than before. Striding along almost like a race walker, I hurried down the road leading to my school.
お父さんがね、最近またちょっとおじさんの耳に入ってくるようなことをやっててね。二宮さんって由美子ちゃんの知り合いにいなかった？ちょうどお母さんと同じぐらいの年の女の人なんだけど、もし知ってたら何でもいいんだ、おじさんに教えてくれないかな。それとこれは由美子ちゃんの家のことなんだけど、お母さんが昔お父さんと一緒に暮らしてた時にお手伝いをしていた人の。
おじさん。
お、なんだい由美子ちゃん。
Coming to an abrupt halt, I turned to face the man.
前にも言いましたが、私何も言いません。質問にも答えません。だからこうやってまとわりつくのをやめてください。
いや、だからだね由美子ちゃん。
名前で慣れ慣れしく呼ぶのもやめてください。失礼します。
やれやれ。父親譲りだな、ありゃ。
There was one significant change in my stagnant life. A reporter from a gossip magazine, whose job seemed to consist of digging for information on my father, was making a habit of loitering around me. I had first met him during the winter of my first year in junior high. At the time, I was still comically naive. He approached with kind words and sympathy, two things I wasn't used to getting, and convinced me to open up to him about my family's circumstances. Pathetic as it was, I didn't realize it was all for an article until the moment my grandmother threw the tabloid in my face and delivered a furious scolding. Humiliated and bitter, I swore to myself to never again discuss personal matters with strangers, or to trust their compassion. And despite it all, the very same journalist had the nerve to show his face in front of me again. Every time something happened, he'd come around sniffing for scraps of information. Speaking with him felt like brushing against an enormous and particularly slimy leech. I marched ahead as quickly as I could, one fierce step after another, trying to shake off the lingering residue of our encounter. But then again, the place I was hurrying to wasn't exactly pleasant in its own right.
駅前んとこのさ、ロータリーのとこでヤマッチいたんよ。声かけたらあいつ逃げやがってさ。
あいつ最近付き合い悪いよな。彼女できたのかな、やっぱし。
嘘、ヤマチ誰かと付き合ってんの？
あれ、知らんかった。C組の木本いんじゃん、あいつの。
It would have been much easier if they had simply treated me like I didn't exist. Their clumsy method of ignoring me could sometimes become a weapon as sharp as any insult. I was well past the point of letting each and every sudden silence weigh on my mind, but it still wasn't exactly a pleasant feeling.
今日も来てんぞ、あれの子が。
あいつ成績はいいけど、母親はあれの病気で病院いるんだよな。
怖いよね。きっとあの子もさ、そういうのを。
The more I tried to ignore them, the more their whispers seemed to pierce their way into my ears. By then, there wasn't a single person in my class who didn't know all about my family. There's no such thing as privacy in the countryside. The real nature of my mother's illness, which should have been kept absolutely confidential by the hospital, had filtered all the way down to middle schoolers' gossip. A purely academic question occurred to me: if this wasn't despair, then what exactly would qualify?
ここも逃げられない。
I opened my sketchbook beneath my desk, making sure that nobody could see. I'd kept it my art, and flipping through the book, it was obvious that my ability to depict fine details had come a long way in the last year. But all that really proved was how obsessively I'd sought escape, how deeply detached I'd grown from the world around me. Rather than pride, I felt something like nausea. Even my art was beginning to lose its value as a refuge. The room was pure white. Nothing had changed here. Not the room, not even my mother's posture in her bed. It was as if I'd never left. Every time I walked in that door and saw her sitting there, I felt a surge of irrepressible pity run through me.
お母さん、来たわよ。あ、ユミコ。いらっしゃい。
As always, I saw my mother in profile. As always, her gaze didn't turn to me. As always, she smiled quietly. But there was no tenderness in that expression. She was simply moving her face into that shape. It was an empty imitation of a real smile.
本持ってきたから。
I lowered a small bundle of books and weekly magazines my mother had requested on the shelf beside her bed. They usually came with the mail, but sometimes I happened to run into a nurse who would hand them over to me for more personal delivery.
そう。ありがとう。
Of course, the weeklies in question were respectable, established publications that largely kept away from the scandals and rumors circulated by the tabloids. We couldn't take the risk of her reading something like that article I'd unwittingly contributed to the previous winter. It undoubtedly would set back her treatment, which was already proceeding slowly enough. My mother's newfound reading habit seems to be a part of an attempt to learn more about my father and the company he was running. Looking at that thick pile of magazines and books, I felt my chest tighten at her obvious desperation. Mom had never known much about the business. I would have been surprised if she could understand half of what she was reading.
ご飯残してるみたいね。看護師さんが言ってた。そう。今度、トシエさんにご飯作ってきてもらうね。病院のよりはずっと美味しいと思うから。そう。
Our interactions followed the same familiar pattern. I chatted away relentlessly while my mother muttered vaguely. Lately, even those monosyllabic responses had grown repetitive and careless. Almost as if she was beginning to treat the world with the same careless disinterest my father had shown her. It was a particularly difficult visit. My mother barely spoke, and I ran out of things to say fairly quickly. As the hours I spent at school had grown increasingly suffocating, I was spending more and more time wandering around in search of quiet places where I could be alone. These days, I frequently found myself lacking for stories to tell.
そろそろ帰るわ。
I rose quietly from my seat. My mother's face, as always, didn't turn toward me. It had been a truly pathetic excuse for a conversation, and I had little hope tomorrow would be any better. The things I wanted to stay the same fell apart. The things I wanted to change stayed exactly as they were. Time no longer seemed to be flowing. It was stagnant. Brackish pool, and even the treading water was becoming a struggle.
あなたが
But as I prepared to leave, my mother spoke. That hadn't happened for quite some time.
お母さん
That one word came as a complete surprise. Was she about to say something? Despite it all, I found myself pausing expectantly, hoping for some positive sign. Thinking the matter over calmly, it was foolish to even imagine her mood had suddenly changed, but I was so starved for a glimmer of hope that my mind latched onto the most optimistic possible interpretation. And then with a few simple words, my naive, happy-end scenario shattered like the fragile piece of glass it had always been.
あなたが男の子だったらよかったのにね。